care homes, we think about comfort, care for our loved ones, as people get older. But
Yeah,
COVID, the pandemic, it really, I think, revealed a much more complicated picture of what was happening.
it sure did. We've seen conversations like this popping up all over the world, haven't we?
Right.
The pandemic's impact on care homes and, yeah, thinking about these protocols that were, designed to protect residents, but what were the potential consequences? Things we maybe didn't think about at the time.
Yeah, and that's exactly what we're diving into today, and specifically focusing on Alberta, Canada. We've got this collection of firsthand accounts, we've got personal stories, official documents, and all of them kind of pointing to these tough questions about the impact of those COVID protocols, on the
Yeah,
residents.
so.
This isn't just about like numbers on a page, is it?
No, no.
This is about understanding people's lived experiences.
It's about real people and those people who care for them, who love them. And yeah, we're going to unpack all of this. We're going to start with this idea, this strategy of focused protection.
Okay, focused protection. I've also heard targeted protection.
Yeah, you hear both.
So break that down.
It was this approach, it was adopted globally, really, wasn't it? To safeguard vulnerable populations,
Right.
particularly in care homes, right?
Yeah.
The idea was to create this kind of protective bubble.
It makes sense, like on the surface, doesn't it?
Yeah.
When you're thinking we've got this novel virus, we don't know much about it.
Yeah,
Let's shield the people who are most at risk.
absolutely.
But the question that this deep dive poses is, did it do more harm than good?
That's what we're grappling with today.
Okay.
The main source that we've got, this website, it's advocating for care home residents in Alberta.
Mm.
And what I found really fascinating about it was just how vivid a picture it paints
Yeah.
of life inside these facilities from 2020 onwards. You've got these strict lockdowns,
Right.
you've got isolation, even when people were asymptomatic,
Wow.
mandatory masking for absolutely everyone,
Wow.
and these really, really strict limitations on family visits.
It's intense. And I think it's important to remember as we kind of go through this that this source is coming from a place of, they are personally invested in this. These are people who have been impacted
Absolutely.
by these very policies. These are their stories. These are their perspectives.
100%. And that's why we're going to be so careful, as we always are, to examine the evidence presented. We'll look at the anecdotes that are shared, the emotions that are kind of interwoven throughout these accounts, and we're going to try and bring you all sides of this really complex issue.
Yeah, let's get into the actual specifics. One of these stories that really jumped out at me was this description of a resident who, clearly impacted by the environment around them, pleads with a visitor to remove their mask, saying, "Don't come near me, I might make you sick."
And imagine internalizing that fear,
I know.
feeling as though you are the danger,
Yeah.
even within your own home. I think it
Uh,
really speaks volumes, doesn't it, about the potential psychological toll.
Huge. And then it goes on, it describes a specific care home where staff were allowed to eat together, unmasked, in common areas,
Okay.
while visitors still had to wear masks.
It makes you think, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Talk about a head scratcher. It really raises questions about consistency and transparency.
Mm-hmm.
Were these rules being applied fairly across the board? You know what I mean?
Right, and like, were they being transparent about it?
Exactly.
Because it goes on to say that even when a senior manager at the facility was challenged about this,
Right.
they defended it. They doubled down. They said, no, the visitors still have to wear their masks.
It's this unsettling feeling, isn't it?
Yeah.
Something's not quite adding up here. If the protocols weren't consistently protecting everyone, then what were the consequences? What were the real consequences for those residents?
That's what I want to know. So let's get into it. Let's go beyond the surface. Let's look at what this source calls the human cost of these measures, the impact that goes way beyond just the virus itself. This isn't just about like surviving a virus, is it? It's about how did these measures, how did they impact people's lives in this broader sense?
Yeah. And you know what I found really interesting was that the source goes beyond just questioning those protocols. Like, were they right or wrong in the first place? And it actually delves into this idea of death by protocol.
Death by protocol.
Yeah, it's a chilling phrase, isn't it?
It is. Break that down for me. What do we actually mean by death by protocol?
Well, in the context of these care homes, what it suggests is that those restrictions, the isolation, even the fear that came with all of those protocols,
Right.
might have actually contributed to a decline in some residents' health, in their well-being, and might have even hastened their deaths.
Mm.
And these are ways that can't be directly attributed to COVID-19.
So not about saying that the virus wasn't dangerous, but saying that there might have been other things at play?
Exactly. Exactly. And one of the things that it highlights is all of these accounts of residents who are experiencing, more isolation, obviously, confusion, and even like severe depression.
Which we know, like social interaction, being connected to people, that's crucial for anyone's well-being.
Of course.
But particularly for seniors who might already be facing, cognitive challenges, emotional challenges.
Absolutely. And it doesn't even stop there. There are also descriptions of residents who became really reluctant, more and more reluctant to seek medical attention,
Oh, wow.
even for things that could have been really serious.
Because they were afraid of being isolated.
Yeah.
It's like this awful catch-22.
It really is. And then if that wasn't unsettling enough, it raises concerns about the potential overuse of certain medications in this environment.
Like what?
Things like morphine, midazolam. So these are medications that are often used in end-of-life care.
Right, and that's a big claim to make. So is there more context there? What are they actually saying?
Yeah, well, the source actually directly connects this to the ongoing debate surrounding MAID,
Yeah, okay.
medical assistance in dying, which is a very complex and sensitive topic, particularly in Canada. And it actually explicitly states they didn't die of COVID, but AHS tried to make it that way.
Wow, okay, hold on. AHS, who are they talking about?
That's Alberta Health Services. So
Uh-huh.
essentially, it's the governing body that oversees healthcare in the province.
So they are saying that this body, this Alberta Health Services, was intentionally hastening deaths, is that what they're saying, through these protocols and potentially even through the use of these medications.
It's important to remember that this is one perspective, one side of a very complicated story.
Right.
So while we're exploring these claims, we really need to be mindful that there are other viewpoints at play, other pieces of this
No,
puzzle.
this is heavy stuff. I mean, where do we even go from here with this?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's easy to get kind of pulled in by the emotion of it all, but you're right. We're not here to point fingers,
Yeah.
make judgments. We're here to try to make sense of it all and present, different perspectives. So I think, yeah, let's zoom out a little bit. We've been talking about Alberta specifically, but this kind of gets at something bigger, doesn't it?
It really does.
About how we navigate these really difficult challenges.
Absolutely.
You mentioned earlier, this is one side, and we want to make sure we're looking at other viewpoints as well. So what are some of those other viewpoints? Because this source, it's not pulling any punches. It's a very strong opinion that they're sharing. So what are some of the other sides of this?
Well, let's rewind for a second to January 2023. Premier Danielle Smith, she was quoted saying, and this is a direct quote, "I think this is very frustrating to me that here we find ourselves, everybody, and has moved on from COVID."
Okay, so it sounds like she's suggesting that there was this feeling of, the public is ready to move past the pandemic. But is that matching up with what we're seeing happening, in November of that same year?
That's the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because alongside that quote, the source includes these images from November 2023 showing that actually, masks were still being used, face shields, all of those restrictive measures were still in place in these care homes.
So almost like a disconnect between maybe what the public narrative was
Yeah,
and the reality.
potentially. And to make things even more kind of murky, the website's creator, who again is personally invested in this issue, describes being denied entry, and not just once, but repeatedly, to visit a loved one because of their mask exemption.
Right, and mask exemptions are a legal right in a lot of places.
Absolutely. Which is what makes this even more striking, I think. And what they also say is that staff within the care home weren't always adhering to those same really stringent masking rules.
Again, it goes back to that consistency, right? Like, are the rules being applied fairly or, across the board? Is there transparency? If someone has an exemption and they're still being denied access, but other people within that environment aren't having to adhere to those same rules,
Yep.
It feels icky. It doesn't feel good.
It really doesn't. And it makes you wonder, were these residents' voices being considered at all? Were their rights being considered?
That's the heart of it, isn't it? So where do we go from here? What are we what are we taking away from all of this?
For me, it goes back to this fundamental question of how do we balance the very real need, and it was a real need, to protect the vulnerable,
Of course.
which was the intention of all of this.
Right.
But how do we balance that with the potential for unintended consequences, with the potential for harm even?
Yeah. And it's that constant reevaluation, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's the communication.
It's communication.
And making sure that people feel heard, making sure those residents feel heard.
Absolutely. And it's making sure those decisions are being made with their best interests at heart.
Yeah. What's kind of sticking with you as we try to wrap our heads around this?
I think it's compassion. I think it's transparency. I think it's open dialogue. And it's not just in a crisis, it's all the time. This has been a heavy one, hasn't it?
It has. It's heavy stuff.
It's forced us to confront some uncomfortable truths and some very complex ethical questions. But even if there aren't any easy answers, I think it's a conversation worth having.
100%. We always say it comes back to listening to these different perspectives,
Yeah.
right? Examining the evidence, even when it's tough, even when it makes us feel uncomfortable,
Yeah.
because that's how we learn from these experiences. And that's how we can hopefully try to make sure that, the well-being and the dignity of all individuals is really at the forefront.
100%. That's what it's all about.
That's what these deep dives are all about. So thank you for coming on this journey with us. Let's keep these conversations going. Let's keep thinking critically about these issues. And until next time.